The year was 1847, and the Utah Territory was nothing but wine-cut plains, coal dust, and the sound of wagon wheels grinding through silence. And yet, men who lived there would later swear that the strangest thing they ever saw wasn't a storm or a wolf pack, it was a single wagon rolling into the settlement, driven by a soft-spoken wanderer named Ezekiel Bennon, and 3 pale, silent young men who followed him like shadows. Records show they looked obedient, too obedient, eyes down, voices gone, movements clipped and controlled, as if waiting for permission to breathe. At first glance, Ezekiel seemed like a preacher searching for peace. But the further men watched him, the more something felt off, a quiet tension clinging to those boys like frost on glass. And years later, when the truth finally cracked open, men would realize he wasn't leading a family. He was building a kingdom of fear, a kingdom designed to obey only him, the Mormon prophet who raised H. If stories like this grip you, one's about control, faith twisted into a weapon, and the men who survived it, hit subscribe and stick around. No pressure, no push, just more real, human stories told with honesty, grit, and respect for the truth. The wagon rolled in at dusk, its wheels murmuring over dry earth as Ezekiel Bennon guided his tired horses toward the settlement, 3 silent young men trailing behind him with disciplined, unsettling composure. Men who witnessed the scene later recalled the strange heaviness in the air, the way Ezekiel moved with deliberate calm while the boys kept their eyes lowered, as if trained to avoid even the softest glimmer of independence. The settlement's men watched from porches and half-finished fences, sensing something unusual in the boys' posture, their tight shoulders, their rigid backs, their quietness that stretched far beyond humility or simple shyness. Ezekiel spoke gently when approached, his voice steady like a practiced sermon, explaining that these young men had lost their families during violent conflict and now followed him in pursuit of spiritual purpose and disciplined living. His beard framed a face shaped by years of preaching, and men easily believed his story, though their eyes kept drifting toward the 3 youths whose silence felt heavy enough to bend the evening air. Whit, the eldest, carried himself with forced maturity, while Vic, hardly more than a man, moved with careful calculation, and young Maurice lingered behind them, as if afraid to exist too close or too far. The settlement welcomed them, offering food and temporary shelter, impressed by Ezekiel's knowledge of Scripture and his calm authority that seemed carved into his bones long before he arrived in the valley. During those first nights, the young men stayed with a farming family whose patriarch immediately noticed how they waited for Ezekiel's approval before eating, speaking, or moving, as though their instincts had been replaced by strict drilled obedience. They rarely lifted their heads, and when they did, their eyes showed a quiet desperation that unsettled the men who tried to befriend them through shared chores and gentle conversation at the dinner table. Whit answered with clipped politeness, Vic whispered his responses like rehearsed lines, and Maurice barely spoke at all, his voice cracking under the weight of something he seemed terrified to name. Ezekiel praised their discipline, calling it a sign of spiritual refinement, though the men who hosted them whispered at night about the unnatural tension that followed the trio like an invisible chain. When Ezekiel secured a small cabin outside the settlement, men gathered to help transport belongings, watching the boys carry crates with tireless precision, never pausing without Ezekiel's nod, never stepping out of formation. The cabin sat in a lonely valley between rocky slopes, a place where silence lived easily and isolation grew thick, an environment Ezekiel claimed was perfect for devotion and inner purification. The men who helped unload supplies noticed that the boys moved with synchronized caution, flinching at sudden noises, avoiding stray glances, and behaving like soldiers drilled under relentless authority. When dusk fell over the valley, Ezekiel thanked the volunteers with solemn gratitude, but the boys stood behind him in a perfect line, silent and tense, as if waiting for permission to breathe again. Back in the settlement, men discussed their unease, though most dismissed it as simple discomfort with unfamiliar religious discipline, trusting Ezekiel's confident explanations more than their own unsettled instincts. Weeks passed, and Ezekiel's sermons drew crowds, his words steady and convincing, while the 3 young men stayed hidden at the cabin, their absence explained as part of rigorous spiritual training. Men accepted this easily, though a few remembered the way the boys had stiffened when Ezekiel raised his voice, and how their eyes reflected something heavier than faith or discipline. Whit, once seen as simply reserved, began losing weight, his face gaunt, his voice hollow when he occasionally accompanied Ezekiel for supplies, speaking mechanically like a man reading from an internal script. Vic appeared thinner too, his movements sharper, his gaze constantly scanning the ground, while Marius looked as though every breath required permission carved into him 3 years of unspoken pressure. The settlement's men noticed these changes, yet Ezekiel's steady presence reassured them, his sermons painting the boys as devoted disciples undergoing rigorous moral refinement. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere thickened daily, Ezekiel enforcing strict schedules, punishing minor mistakes with silence or controlled reprimands, slowly shaping every moment of the boys' lives into instruments of obedience. Their brotherly bond strained under constant scrutiny, as Ezekiel encouraged them to report small missteps and maintain extreme vigilance against imagined spiritual corruption. Outside, the valley swallowed sound, becoming the perfect backdrop for Ezekiel's tightening control, a place where no stray ear could overhear the sharpness in his tone or the fear settling into the boy's eyes. Whit tried to remain strong, shielding Vic and Marius whenever possible, though Ezekiel seemed determined to break any alliance that threatened his absolute command. Vic grew quieter as Ezekiel shifted his attention onto him, praising his potential one day and undermining him the next, a rhythm that left the young man constantly uncertain and isolated. Marius, still growing into adulthood, trembled under Ezekiel's shadow, sensing danger in every gesture, every silence, every sudden shift in their guardian's unpredictable mood. As summer heat settled over the valley, the boys' exhaustion became visible, their bodies worn from dawn-to-night labor and endless recitations of doctrine enforced with rigid exactness. The men who occasionally glimpsed them during supply trips sensed something growing darker, though none could fully name it, and Ezekiel's steady confidence overshadowed their uneasy suspicions. Inside the cabin, Ezekiel's teachings sharpened into commands, his gentle tone eroding into authority laced with expectation, leaving the boys uncertain where faith ended and fear began. Whit studied Ezekiel's moods carefully, knowing each unpredictable shift meant another tightening of rules, another night of whispered warnings between the brothers after Ezekiel fell asleep. Vic noticed the windows had been shuttered more often, as though Ezekiel feared wandering eyes, while Marius counted the boards nailed across one frame, feeling the walls physically closing around their lives. Ezekiel spoke increasingly about destiny, purpose, and obedience, his sermons at home filled with long stretches of silence broken by gentle words that carried a cold undercurrent of absolute command. By autumn, the settlement saw less of the boys and more of Ezekiel, his trips brief, his expression pressed tight with the strain of maintaining a perfect spiritual facade. In the valley, the boys sensed that something unseen was building, a pressure gathering like a storm behind the mountains, waiting for the moment when obedience would no longer be enough to survive. The valley's mornings grew sharper as wind crawled between the rocks, carrying a chill that settled into the cabin where Whit, Vic, and Marius awoke before dawn under Ezekiel's strict, unwavering command. Each day began with silence, the kind that pressed against their ribs, as Ezekiel paced behind them reciting doctrine while the brothers repeated memorized lines, their voices steady but drained of anything resembling youthful conviction or choice. Whit noticed Ezekiel watching him with calculated interest, as though measuring how much obedience he could extract before the young man broke, pushing him harder with longer tasks and harsher corrections spoken through calm authority. Vic suffered differently, absorbing Ezekiel's scrutiny like a weight strapped to his shoulders, forcing his movements to shrink into cautious patterns shaped by fear that every misstep would invite another unpredictable reaction. Marius felt the pressure most intensely, sensing Ezekiel's presence in every corner of the cabin, his breath tightening whenever he heard footsteps behind him, knowing the older man expected submission polished to perfection. Ezekiel crafted routines designed to eliminate doubt, structuring the day so rigidly that the brothers no longer distinguished morning from evening, living within cycles of ordered labor and controlled moments of enforced contemplation. The valley itself became part of Ezekiel's discipline, its isolation echoing his teachings, reinforcing the message that the outside world was dangerous and only within his guidance could a man find true spiritual safety. During supply trips, Ezekiel monitored the brothers' movements carefully, positioning them slightly behind him, ensuring they spoke only when prompted, their gazes fixed downward to avoid interactions that might threaten his authority. Men in the settlement noticed their growing timidity, though Ezekiel explained it as deepening devotion, claiming the brothers were undergoing intense refinement necessary for the creation of disciplined, righteous men. Whit privately resisted the idea, his instincts rebelling against the notion that obedience required fear, though he learned to keep those thoughts buried beneath layers of controlled expressions and carefully measured words. Vic struggled to maintain composure during Ezekiel's longer sermons inside the cabin, the older man's voice becoming a relentless rhythm that seeped into his mind until he questioned whether resistance was even possible. Maurice clung to his older brothers, drawing strength from their presence, though Ezekiel subtly separated them, assigning tasks that kept them apart, breaking quiet moments where brotherhood could strengthen their resolve. When Ezekiel introduced new rules limiting conversations between the brothers, Whit felt something inside him twist, realizing the older man intended to dismantle their unity piece by piece. Vic found himself rehearsing sentences in his mind, afraid any unguarded word might trigger Ezekiel's scrutiny, a feeling that turned every interaction into a silent battle to maintain control of his thoughts. Maurice sometimes woke in the night gripping his own arms to stop trembling, listening for Ezekiel's steps, terrified that any sound might draw unwanted attention toward his growing inability to mask fear. Ezekiel framed these restrictions as sacred refinement, claiming separation allowed each man to develop his own spiritual identity, though Whit recognized it as deliberate fragmentation meant to weaken their collective strength. Outside, the valley grew colder as autumn settled in, frost forming on the window frames Ezekiel had begun sealing more tightly, convinced external influences threatened the purity of their disciplined environment. Whit noticed boards being added across certain shutters, small signs that Ezekiel feared intrusion, yet he offered no explanation beyond vague warnings about worldly corruption seeking to infiltrate their sanctuary. Vic watched Ezekiel's habits change, noting how the older man lingered near the cabin's perimeter, scanning the horizon as though expecting visitors who might challenge the absolute control he relied upon daily. Maurice sensed danger beneath Ezekiel's calm exterior, detecting tension in the way he handled simple tasks, his movements sharper, his patience shorter, as though something unseen tightened around him. Inside, Ezra's teachings became more severe, filled with warnings about betrayal and discipline, his tone sharpening enough to make the brothers feel each word as an unspoken threat etched into their bones. Whit began noticing patterns in Ezekiel's behavior, recognizing that his calmest moments preceded strict no commands, and his softest tones often masked the coldest expectations. Vic found himself analyzing the cabin's smallest details, searching for signs of how Ezekiel planned each day, hoping to predict shifts in mood before they erupted into tighter restrictions. Maurice retreated deeper into himself, seeking ways to remain unnoticed, hoping invisibility would spare him from the pressure that forced the brothers into constant internal caution. During one long sermon, Ezekiel spoke of destiny shaped through obedience, his voice resonating through the cabin while Whit felt a quiet fury rising, though he kept his expression neutral to avoid detection. Vic sensed Whit's inner tension, recognizing the same resistance growing inside himself, though neither spoke of it aloud, fearing Ezekiel's rule that forbade private conversations. Maurice watched his brothers with a mix of admiration and fear, sensing their strength yet knowing Ezekiel's influence was tightening with every passing day, shaping them into versions of themselves they barely recognized. The valley's silence grew heavier as Ezekiel reduced the brothers' trips to the settlement, claiming spiritual preparation required fewer distractions, though Whit saw it as an attempt to sever their final ties. Vic longed for the brief glimpses of normalcy outside the valley, remembering how the settlement's men had casual conversations that felt impossibly distant from the controlled existence inside the cabin. Maurice missed the simple comfort of shared laughter, a sound that had vanished from their lives because Ezekiel dismissed it as frivolous and spiritually undisciplined. As the days shortened, Ezekiel's teachings intensified, each speech feeling like a tightening rope, pushing the brothers into deeper submission while quietly inflaming the spark of resistance none dared voice aloud. By winter's edge, the cabin felt smaller than ever, the valley colder, and the brothers realized Ezekiel was no longer merely guiding them but reshaping them entirely, preparing them for something unspoken yet looming in the shadows. Cold air slid across Deep Hollow Ridge as dusk settled, carrying the metallic bite of rusted beams and scorched timber, reminding every man nearby that forgotten violence still pulsed beneath the broken foundations scattered across the slope. Wine threaded through fractured doorframes like an old warning, stirring ashes left from fires set by men who believed domination could rewrite destiny, their shadows lingering long after their bodies vanished into unmarked ground. The ridge had once been ruled by a lineage of hardened men who taught obedience through gritted teeth and tightened fists, forging generations who understood survival not as freedom but conditioned acceptance demanded by relentless authority. Records show the earliest leaders carved their rules into wooden beams, insisting every boy memorize them by candlelight while storms battered the walls, shaping loyalty through fear and crafting silence into a sacred commandment. Those men passed their teachings to sons, nephews, and wanderers seeking protection, constructing a closed world where questioning the hierarchy meant punishment severe enough to echo through skeletal floors long after dawn arrived. Inside the main lodge, the last of the elders trained younger men through brutal routines, forcing them to carry logs up steep ridges, claiming strength would break weakness and unify them under a single unchallenged order. Merrick, one of the youngest recruits, learned early to keep his voice steady and his eyes forward, knowing hesitation invited scrutiny from men who measured worth in how little fear you showed under pressure. Eldrick, older and once defiant, bore scars from resisting the order, his back marked by switches wielded to carve obedience into anyone whose will threatened the tightly controlled hierarchy established by the Ridge's oldest families. Jace, quiet and observant, memorized every crack in the walls and every shift in the elders' routines, planning escape routes silently though he never voiced them, afraid whispers alone might bring consequences he couldn't outmaneuver. For years, the Ridge operated beyond law or witness, hidden by terrain and reinforced by fear, until one storm-heavy evening when fractures within the Brotherhood grew visible enough to shake the mountain's long-standing balance. That night began with thunder rolling low across the valley, vibrating through collapsed rafters while the men inside the lodge prepared for another round of exercises meant to break hesitation and bind them to unyielding discipline. Merrick sensed tension in the elders' movements, noticing glances exchanged with restrained distrust, as though cracks in leadership were widening, testing the loyalty of men once certain their power could withstand any internal challenge. Eldrick stood near the doorway, shoulder pressed to splintered wood, watching the elders too closely, his instincts whispering that the Ridge's order was faltering, its core shaken by secrets buried longer than anyone admitted. Jace, sorting tools near the dying hearth, felt the temperature shift when the head elder arrived late, his expression hardened, his breath uneven, carrying the aura of a man rattled by unseen developments outside. Rumors had spread earlier that day about strangers spotted near the mountain's base, prompting unease among the leadership, who believed outsiders represented threats capable of dismantling their generation's held control. When the elders gathered around the central table, their voices lowered, carrying tones of doubt unusual for men who once commanded the Ridge with confidence carved from years of unquestioned dominance. Merrick approached cautiously, hearing fragments of conversation about disappearing supplies and unusual tracks leading from the lower path, evidence suggesting someone inside the Ridge had begun acting independently against established authority. Eldrick's jaw tightened as he listened, understanding rebellion was forming within their ranks, a spark capable of igniting chaos that could either free the younger men or bury them beneath intensified control. Jace felt his heartbeat quicken, recognizing opportunity in the disruption, knowing fractured leadership meant weaker surveillance and more openings for him to slip unnoticed through the Ridge's perimeter under the cover of darkness. Outside, thunder cracked again, shaking loose dust from charred beams, making lantern light flicker across hardened faces grown tense with the realization that the system controlling them for decades was fraying dangerously. When the elders ordered every man to assemble in the courtyard, Merrick joined the line, standing shoulder to shoulder with men whose fear simmered beneath stoic expressions, each aware punishment awaited anyone resisting. The head elder declared the new decree, tightening curfews and limiting movement, framing the restrictions as protective measures though every man recognized them as desperate attempts to reinforce quickly weakening authority. Eldrick met Merrick's eyes briefly, conveying silent acknowledgement that the Ridge's rules were no longer invincible, that their captors felt threatened, and that fear had finally begun to shift toward the men enforcing obedience. Jace slipped toward the back of the formation, careful to remain unnoticed while studying guard rotations, mapping the path he intended to take once darkness thickened enough to hide his movements from watchful eyes. Inside the lodge, lanterns burned low as elders debated measures to reclaim control, unaware their voices carried through cracks in the timber, allowing the younger men to overhear doubts they had never witnessed before. Merrick felt bravery stirring for the first time, recognizing fear in the elders' tones, realizing the men who shaped their world through intimidation were breaking under pressure they couldn't fully contain. Eldrick leaned close to Jace during a rare unattended moment, muttering that if an escape were ever possible, tonight offered the best chance the Ridge had seen in decades of Titan rule. Jace nodded subtly, understanding the weight of the risk, knowing capture meant brutal retaliation, yet recognizing that remaining meant dying slowly under a hierarchy fueled by unending dominance and psychological erosion. As night deepened, rain swept across the Ridge, masking footsteps with steady drumming, creating a natural shield for any man willing to cross the lines drawn by generations of fear and enforced obedience. Merrick stepped into the storm first, heart pounding, eyes scanning shadows for patrols, while Eldrick followed close behind, determined not to let the youngest risk the mountain alone against men raised on control. Jace guided them toward a break in the outer fence, the one he had monitored for months, its posts weakened from rot and storms, representing the only boundary not reinforced after recent internal tensions. Behind them, lanterns flickered in the lodge windows as elders realized men were missing, shouting commands that sliced through rain-soaked darkness while the fugitives sprinted for the lower trail leading into forgotten wilderness. The mountain growled with storm and memory, carrying the fleeing men forward, guiding them away from the Ridge's collapsing rule, and marking the night its century-old hierarchy finally began to crumble beneath the weight of awakening resistance. Cold morning haze crawled over the blackened skeleton of Deep Hollow Ridge as surviving men stepped through the ruins, each breath carrying memories they wished they could bury beneath ash and cracked stone. Wine scraped across twisted metal, humming through broken support beams like a warning from a past that refused to loosen its grip, reminding every man present that silence had been both weapon and shield. Those who returned to the Ridge years later carried new scars across their arms and heavier ones across their minds, shaped by years spent under elders who wielded authority like iron forged for control. According to preserved accounts, the survivors moved slowly, studying every fracture in the walls, as if expecting the ghosts of the old hierarchy to step out and demand obedience one final time. Ronan, once a stubborn recruit, felt his pulse tighten as he crossed the threshold of the main lodge, remembering nights spent standing in freezing corners while elders tested loyalty through punishing endurance. Garrick, broader and older, carried himself with quiet caution, his gaze scanning corners where he once hid bruises beneath rough blankets, knowing those moments had carved discipline deeper than any carved commandment. Thorn walked between them, his steps careful, surveying the space where younger men once whispered small rebellions, their voices shaking with fear but desperate for hope they barely understood. The survivors paused near a fallen beam, noticing markings carved decades earlier by men long gone, each symbol representing rules that shaped an entire generation into obedient shadows struggling to recognize themselves. Ronan brushed dust from an inscription, feeling its sharp grooves beneath his fingertips, remembering how men were forced to learn these lines word for word before they could speak freely again. Outside, charred branches cracked beneath their boots as they wandered toward the old training yard, where winters once hardened their spirits through relentless drills supposedly meant to strengthen unity, but instead forged quiet resentment. Records show exercises were brutal, designed to strip weakness and replace it with endurance, yet the price was steep, leaving men bonded not by trust but shared survival against the hierarchy's relentless pressure. Garrick stopped near the rusted water barrel, remembering how men collapsed beside it during summer drills, their breaths thin, their muscles trembling while elders insisted pain would cleanse doubt from their minds. Thorn knelt beside a collapsed platform where younger recruits once stood trembling during evaluations, feeling a surge of anger toward the system that shaped boys into weapons meant to protect a legacy of fear. Ronan's jaw tightened as he stared across the ridge, recalling nights when storms rattled the roof while elders lectured about loyalty, discipline, and the expectation that no man questioned the authority handed down. Inside the auxiliary cabin, Garrick traced his fingers across burned floorboards, remembering the night a rebellious recruit tried to flee, only to be dragged back and forced into harsher routines meant to break him. Thorn inhaled the scent of charred timber, recalling whispered conversations about escape that never grew into action until the night fractures in leadership spread like cracks across frozen ground. The survivors moved deeper into the ruins, stepping over shattered lanterns and fragmented tools once used to enforce endless chores that trained men to equate obedience with safety and silence with survival. According to eyewitness testimony, unity among the younger men was forbidden, considered dangerous by elders who feared their bond might unravel the tightly controlled structure sustaining the Ridge's generational rule. Ronan paused near the cellar entrance, staring into darkness where men were once ordered to reflect on their mistakes, spending hours alone while the mountain's cold breath pressed against their skin. Garrick descended first, boots echoing against stone, recalling the weight of being told that suffering built character, though suffering only taught him how deeply control could burrow into a man's identity. Thorn followed, eyes sweeping across dusty shelves where elders stored their ledgers, documenting every infraction as though cataloging the lives they shaped, twisted, and burdened under the guise of righteous discipline. The survivors found an old journal, charred but readable, filled with entries detailing punishments recorded without remorse, reinforcing the belief that authority justified any act needed to maintain the ridge's order. Ronan closed the journal with a steady breath, refusing to let old memories reclaim him, knowing they were here not to relive torment but to understand how deep the system's roots once reached. Outside again, Garrick studied the horizon, remembering how the first men who escaped described freedom as disorienting, a quiet so unfamiliar it felt like standing in a world without gravity. Thorn noted how nature reclaimed everything, the moss covering old railings, vines threading through collapsed walls, proof that time dismantled structures even when men believed fear could preserve them forever. The survivors gathered near the ridge's edge, overlooking the valley where their first steps toward freedom once began, taken with trembling resolve and the realization that escape required unlearning years of conditioned obedience. Ronan spoke quietly, acknowledging how each man carried remnants of the ridge's doctrine, shadows lingering in their thoughts no matter how far they traveled or how fiercely they rebuilt their lives. Garrick admitted anger still lived within him, not toward the men they were, but the men they were forced to become, shaped by a system designed to break spirit for control. Thorn let his breath settle, understanding that survival wasn't the end of their story. Recovery demanded confronting memories that clung to them like smoke long after the flames died. The survivors turned back toward the ruins, recognizing that stepping into the past allowed them to reclaim ownership over what once controlled them, transforming scars into something closer to strength. Wine surged across Deep Hollow Ridge, stirring ash and loose debris, as though the mountain exhaled with them, acknowledging their return and the quiet power in their collective act of remembrance. Together, they walked away from the shattered lodge, leaving the ghosts behind, carrying only what they chose to hold, brotherhood forged not by fear, but by survival, endurance, and a bond stronger than the fire that once consumed their world.